May 12, 1945, 4:45 hours. The southern slopes of Sugarloaf Hill, Okinawa. The pre-dawn air is thick, a suffocating blanket of cordite, churned earth, and the cloying sweetness of decay. It clings to the skin, a damp shroud in the Okinawan humidity. For Private First Class Leo Miller, 6th Marine Division, it is the taste of the world's end. He lies pressed against the scarred soil, his knuckles white around the cold, serrated body of a Mk2 fragmentation grenade. It feels familiar in his hand, heavy, solid. Almost the exact weight and shape of the scuffed-up hardball he used to throw back home in Ohio, the one with the stitching coming loose. He closes his eyes for a second. A dangerous luxury. The memory floods in unbidden. A sun-drenched afternoon, the smell of cut grass, the satisfying thwack of the ball hitting his father's worn leather mitt, his dad's voice a low rumble of encouragement. Just find your spot, son. See it in your mind, then let it fly. It's all in the wrist. Back then, the target was a catcher's glove. The consequence of a bad throw was a runner advancing to second base. Here, the target is a narrow slit in a coral limestone bunker, barely visible in the gloom 50 yards up the slope. The consequence of a bad throw is a burst of machine gun fire from a Type 92, a weapon his squad mates have grimly nicknamed the Woodpecker. A bad throw gets you, and the men who followed you killed. A low whistle, barely audible over the ringing in his ears, cuts through the night. The signal. Time to move! Leo's heart hammers against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the distant symphony of naval artillery. Around him, the shadows of other Marines stir, their movements economical and silent, ghosts rising from a dead earth. They are boys who should be worrying about summer jobs and taking girls to the drive-in. Instead, they are here, on this god-forsaken lump of rock in the middle of the Pacific, about to assault a position the veterans are already calling Hell's Front Porch. The Japanese soldiers waiting for them in the darkness of their bunkers are veterans of Manchuria and China. They are masters of defense, patient and utterly ruthless. In their briefings, they were told the Americans were soft, decadent, reliant on their machines. They were merchants and farmers, not warriors. They played childish games. The concept of grown men dedicating themselves to throwing and hitting a small ball was a source of dark amusement, a sign of a weak culture. They were about to learn, in the most brutal way imaginable, that some games teach lethal lessons. They laughed at baseball. Soon, they would be forced to play. By May 1945, the Battle of Okinawa had devolved into a brutal war of attrition. The initial American landings on April 1st had been deceptively easy. But as the U.S. 10th Army, a massive formation comprising the Army's 4th Corps and the 3 Amphibious Corps of the Marine Corps, pushed south, they ran headlong into the island's true defenses. The Shuri Line. This was not a single line, but a labyrinthine defense in depth, a multi-layered network of interlocking fortifications, caves, and pillboxes masterfully integrated into the island's rugged, hilly terrain. The architect of this defense, Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, commander of the Japanese 32nd Army, had rejected the disastrous banzai charges of previous island battles. His strategy was one of pure attrition. He would make the Americans bleed for every inch of Okinawan soil, hoping to inflict such horrific casualties that their will to invade the Japanese home islands would be broken. His 110,000 men, a mix of seasoned IJA regulars and Okinawan conscripts, were dug in with formidable tenacity. The focus of this brutal calculus in mid-May was a series of 3 hills that formed a key bastion of the Shuri Line. Sugarloaf Hill, Half Moon Hill, and Horseshoe Ridge. Of these, Sugarloaf was the linchpin. It was not a towering peak, but an unassuming ugly mound of earth and rock, barely 50 feet high. Yet, it dominated the surrounding terrain and the approaches to the city of Shuri itself. Its slopes were a honeycomb of interconnected tunnels, machine gun nests, and mortar pits, all providing interlocking fields of fire. The primary defensive works were built into the reverse slope, the side facing away from the American advance. This brilliant tactical choice protected them from direct fire from American artillery and naval guns. They would wait for the Marines to crest the hill, and then annihilate them from unseen positions on the other side. The American force tasked with cracking this nut was the 6th Marine Division. They were equipped with the best weaponry the United States could produce. The M1 Garand rifle provided semi-automatic, high-volume firepower that was the envy of the world. The Browning automatic rifle, or BAR, served as the base of fire for every squad. M4 Sherman tanks, including variants armed with devastating flamethrowers, were available for support. And crucially, every Marine carried an arsenal of grenades. The primary tool was the Mk2 fragmentation grenade, the iconic pineapple. Its cast-iron serrated body was designed to shatter into hundreds of high-velocity metal shards. It weighed 21 ounces, had a 4 to 5 second fuse, and could be thrown roughly 30 to 35 meters by the average soldier. The tactical problem was immense. Standard infantry assaults, even when supported by tanks and artillery, were being shattered against the Japanese defenses. The Marines would painstakingly fight their way to the top of Sugarloaf, suffering terrible casualties, only to be driven off by a storm of fire from the reverse slope and counterattacks from tunnels on the flanks. The hill became a charnel house. The challenge was not just to take the ground, but to neutralize the dozens of hidden positions from which the Japanese could pour down fire. It required a shift from macro-level assaults to micro-level tactics. It would come down to small teams of Marines, armed with rifles and bags of grenades, engaging individual pillboxes in a deadly intimate duel. For Private Miller, the world had shrunk to the few dozen yards of torn earth in front of him. The grand strategy, the maps in the command tent, the movement of divisions, all of it was meaningless abstraction. Reality was the man next to him, Corporal Jensen, clutching his bar so tight his knuckles were bone white. Reality was the acrid smell of his own sweat and fear. Reality was the weight of the 8 Mk2 grenades hooked onto his webbing. His training at Paris Island had been a blur of screaming drill instructors, forced marches, and endless weapons drills. They had practiced throwing grenades, of course. They were taught to lob them in a high arc, to take cover, to count the fuse. It was a mechanical, impersonal process. But for Leo, and thousands of young Americans like him, there was another, deeper training that had been ingrained in them since childhood. It was the training of the sandlot, the schoolyard, the baseball diamond. The muscle memory was profound. The slight turn of the hips, the cocking of the arm, the snap of the wrist, the follow-through. For years, he had practiced throwing a baseball with speed and accuracy. He could hit a glove from 60 feet away. He could throw a curveball that broke just over the plate. He had spent countless hours transforming a simple human motion into a precise, repeatable skill. Now, that skill, honed in the innocence of sport, had a new, terrifying purpose. As they waited for the second signal, the one that meant go, he ran through the motions in his mind. Pull the pin. Let the spoon fly. 1001, 1002. He had to cook it, to shorten the fuse so the Japanese couldn't throw it back. Too short, and it would detonate in the air. Too long, and it would give them a chance. It was a deadly calculation, performed in a split second under unimaginable pressure. He glanced at the other men in his fire team. There was O'Malley, a fast-talking kid from Brooklyn who had boasted about playing stickball in the streets. There was Schmidt, a quiet farm boy from Wisconsin who could supposedly throw a rock and hit a fence post from 100 yards. They were all, in their own way, products of a culture that threw things. It was a national quirk, a pastime that had unwittingly prepared an entire generation of young men for this specific brutal type of warfare. They weren't just soldiers. They were pitchers, outfielders, and quarterbacks, and their target was no longer a piece of leather, but a steel and concrete emplacement spitting death. The fear was a cold knot in his stomach, but beneath it, there was a flicker of something else, a grim, focused certainty. He knew how to do this. He had been practicing his entire life. Inside the bunker, Sergeant Kenji Tanaka of the 44th Independent Mixed Brigade listened to the distant American bombardment. He was a veteran, his face a mask of stoic calm that concealed a deep-seated contempt for his enemy. He had fought the Chinese at Changsha, where courage and the bayonet had decided battles. He held the deep-seated belief of the Imperial Japanese Army, that the spiritual strength of the Japanese warrior, his willingness to die for the emperor, was the ultimate weapon, superior to any material advantage. He viewed the Americans through this lens. They were clumsy, loud, and wasteful. They saturated the landscape with explosives, hoping to crush resistance through sheer industrial might. But when their machines failed, when it came down to man against man, they were weak. He had seen them break and run in previous assaults. He had watched them bunch up, making easy targets for his Type 92 heavy machine gun. Their tactics were predictable. A massive artillery barrage followed by a frontal human wave. From his position, cut deep into the coral rock of Sugarloaf, he felt secure. The bunker was a masterpiece of defensive engineering. The firing aperture, or embrasure, was small, angled to provide a wide field of fire while presenting a minimal target. The walls were reinforced with steel and concrete, thick enough to withstand all but a direct hit from the heaviest artillery shell. The interior was connected by a tunnel to other positions, allowing for reinforcement or retreat. He and his men were prepared. The machine gun was sighted on the most likely avenue of approach. Crates of ammunition were stacked neatly against the wall. Beside them were boxes of Type 97 hand grenades. They were lighter than the American grenades and less powerful, but they were reliable. Crucially, the Type 97 had an impact fuse. The soldier would strike the fuse on his helmet and throw it, and it would detonate on contact. This meant they could never be thrown back. It was, in his mind, a superior design, born of practical combat experience. Unlike the clumsy timed fuse grenades of the Americans, Tanaka and his comrades shared stories they had heard about the Americans, stories of their obsession with Beibu Soru, baseball. They found it baffling. How could a nation of warriors spend so much time on such a frivolous activity? It confirmed their prejudices. The Americans were children, playing games while Japan was engaged in a holy war for its own survival. He expected the coming attack to be a repeat of the last. The Marines would charge up the slope, straight into his kill zone. He would hold his fire until they were close, then squeeze the trigger of the Type 92 and watch them fall, just as they had before. The thought brought a thin, cold smile to his lips. Let them come. The second whistle was sharper, more urgent. It cut through the din and jolted Leo Miller into motion. Go, go, go! The words were a guttural roar from his squad leader. They moved, not in a clumsy upright charge, but in a low, scuttling rush, darting from crater to crater. The world erupted. The air was ripped apart by the staccato hammering of Japanese machine guns, the sharp crack of Arisaka rifles, and the deeper, rhythmic thumping of Jensen's bar, laying down a base of fire. Tracers, green and angry, crisscrossed the space above their heads. Miller's fire team reached their designated position, a shallow shell scrape about 60 yards from Tanaka's bunker. The woodpecker opened up, its fire chewing the dirt just in front of them, kicking up a spray of rock and soil. They were pinned. A frontal assault was suicide. Miller! O'Malley! Put some heat on that pillbox. The squad leader screamed over the noise. We'll cover you! This was it. Jensen shifted his bar, sending a long, sustained burst directly at the bunker's narrow slit. The bullets sparked and ricocheted off the concrete. A steel hailstorm designed for one purpose: to force the gunner inside to duck, to give the grenadiers a window of a few precious seconds. Leo pulled the first grenade from his webbing. His movements were fluid, economical, driven by pure instinct. He hooked his index finger through the pin's ring and pulled. It came free with a metallic scrape. He let the spring-loaded safety lever, the spoon, press into the palm of his hand. As long as he held it, the fuse was not armed. He locked his eyes on the target. The narrow, dark rectangle of the firing slit. He could see it in his mind, just like his father's glove. He pushed up onto one knee. See it in your mind, then let it fly. He released the spoon. A faint ping as it flew off. The fuse was now burning. 1001, 1002. His arm came back in a smooth, practiced motion. It was not a lob. It was a throw. A pitcher's throw. His body uncoiled, his torso rotating, his arm whipping forward in a powerful, controlled arc. The grenade left his hand, a dark oval spinning against the gray sky. Inside the bunker, Sergeant Tanaka was momentarily blinded by the storm of bullets impacting his position. He cursed the Americans and their profligate use of ammunition. He hunkered down for a moment, waiting for the burst to end, his hand ready on the machine gun's trigger. He heard a strange, faint clatter at the mouth of the embrasure, followed by a metallic thud as something small and heavy hit the floor behind him. His blood ran cold. Grenade! He had a split second to react. His training screamed at him to grab it, to throw it back out. But as his eyes fixed on the object rolling on the dusty floor, he saw its shape. The ridged pineapple. The American timed fuse. He had maybe 2 seconds. The Mk2 detonated. The world vanished in a concussion of fire, sound, and searing metal. The confined space of the bunker magnified the blast tenfold, turning it into a pressure cooker of death. The air was sucked from Tanaka's lungs as hundreds of fragments of jagged steel, traveling faster than the speed of sound, shredded everything inside the concrete box. The Type 92 machine gun was twisted into a useless sculpture of mangled metal. The patient, veteran sergeant, and his crew were killed instantly. Outside, Leo was already reaching for his next grenade. To his right, O'Malley was doing the same. His throw was different, a quick side-armed flick like a shortstop turning a double play. Another grenade arced through the air, disappearing into a different bunker opening. Another muffled crump, another nest silenced. They worked as a team, a deadly battery of pitchers and catchers. One man provided suppressing fire while the others threw. They didn't just throw high, They threw fast and low, skipping grenades off the ground like flat stones on a pond, sending them skittering into cave mouths. They threw with an accuracy that was terrifying, a skill the Japanese had never anticipated and had no defense against. The game was on, and the Americans were playing for keeps. The Japanese defense on Sugarloaf Hill was predicated on a specific set of assumptions. They assumed the Americans would rely on overwhelming firepower from a distance, followed by predictable channelized infantry assaults up the forward slope. Their entire network was designed to counter this doctrine. The reverse slope positions were shielded from artillery. The interlocking machine gun nests were placed to create inescapable kill zones for any troops who crested the hill. They were prepared for a battle of mass and attrition. What they were not prepared for was precision. They were not prepared for individual soldiers to possess the ability to deliver a handheld explosive charge through a 2-foot-wide opening from over 30 yards away, while under fire. The effect of the Marines' baseball arm assault was catastrophic and immediate. Positions that had seemed impregnable were suddenly, shockingly vulnerable. The Japanese soldiers huddled in their bunkers felt their fortresses turn into tombs. They had expected to be safe from anything short of a direct hit from a tank. Instead, they were being systematically eliminated by small, thrown objects. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical one. A Japanese soldier's doctrine was to hold his ground to the death. His bunker was his final fighting position, but that doctrine was based on the idea that he could fight back. When a grenade landed in the confined space, there was nothing to do. There was no countermove. It was simply over. This helplessness bred a new kind of terror. The laughter and contempt for the soft American playing his games was replaced with a horrifying respect for his lethal skill. The Americans were not just throwing. They were thinking. They were using the terrain, employing cover and working in coordinated teams. A bar gunner would suppress a target drawing its fire. Under that cover, a grenadier would advance to a better throwing position. They were adapting a fundamental American athletic skill to solve a complex tactical problem. They were turning the tide of the battle not with a new superweapon, but with a refined application of the oldest weapon of all, a thrown rock. Across the slopes of Sugarloaf, the same scene was playing out. Squad by squad, platoon by platoon, the Marines were pitching their way up the hill. They cleared one bunker, then used its cover to engage the next. The intricate web of the Japanese defense was being unpicked, thread by thread, from the inside out. The unexpected outcome was not merely that the Americans were winning, it was how they were winning. They were beating the Japanese at their own game of close-quarters combat, using a skill their enemy had fatally underestimated. For the surviving Japanese defenders, the world had turned upside down. The familiar rhythm of battle, the roar of artillery, the charge, the disciplined response was broken. It was replaced by a new, more terrifying cadence. A brief hail of bullets against their position, followed by a pause of a few seconds, pregnant with dread. Then, the sickening thud of a grenade landing inside their sanctuary, and the final obliterating flash. The morale, once iron-hard and forged in the fires of Bushido, began to crack. A sense of profound injustice crept in. How could this be? How could these undisciplined boys, who cared only for movies and sweets, be so deadly? The Americans weren't fighting like soldiers. They were fighting like something else, something alien. Their ability to place grenades with such precision felt like a dark magic. Panic began to supplant discipline. Some Japanese soldiers, hearing the telltale thud of a grenade landing nearby, would bolt from the relative safety of their bunkers, only to be cut down by the watchful bars and garans of the supporting Marine fire teams. The carefully constructed defense, which relied on every position supporting the others, began to fail as individual bunkers went silent one by one. The interlocking fields of fire were broken, creating gaps that the Marines ruthlessly exploited. For the Marines, the psychological effect was the polar opposite. After days of being senselessly ground down by the Japanese meat grinder, they had found a way to fight back that worked. It was empowering. The act of throwing a grenade became a deeply personal act of aggression and control. Unlike firing a rifle at a distant, unseen enemy, this was intimate. They could see their target. They could watch the arc of their throw. They could hear the resulting explosion and know with grim certainty that they had neutralized a threat. This newfound effectiveness bred a cold, professional confidence. The fear was still there, a constant companion, but it was now overlaid with a sense of purpose and a belief that they could win. They were no longer just cogs in a machine, charging into a wall of fire. They were skilled specialists, Pitchers in the deadliest game ever played, and they were throwing a perfect game. The transformation was complete. The boys of summer had become the angels of death, and their national pastime had given them the edge in one of the bloodiest battles of the Second World War. The battle for Sugarloaf Hill raged for 10 days. The 6th Marine Division would take the hill, be driven off by ferocious counterattacks, and retake it multiple times. Entire companies were rendered combat ineffective, but the tide had turned. The innovative small-unit grenade tactics, honed in the crucible of combat, proved to be the key that unlocked the Japanese defenses. On May 21st, the hill was finally and irrevocably secured by the Marines. The cost was staggering. In the fight for Sugarloaf and the surrounding ridges, the 6th Marine Division suffered over 2,600 casualties. The hill itself was a nightmarish landscape, cratered beyond recognition and littered with the debris of war and the bodies of the fallen from both sides. But its capture broke the back of the western anchor of the Shuri Line, paving the way for the eventual capture of Shuri Castle and the collapse of organized Japanese resistance in the south. The broader impact of this tactical adaptation cannot be overstated. It was a lesson learned in blood on Okinawa that would inform U.S. infantry doctrine for decades to come. The battle demonstrated that in certain combat environments, urban warfare, clearing bunkers, fighting in dense terrain, the skill of the individual grenadier was as important as the firepower of the machine gunner. It highlighted the critical need for adaptability and for leveraging the unique, and sometimes unexpected, skill sets of the common soldier. In the grand narrative of World War II, filled with tales of massive naval battles, epic tank clashes, and strategic bombing campaigns, the story of the Grenadiers of Sugarloaf Hill is a vital, human-scale reminder of how wars are truly won, yard by yard, bunker by bunker, by ordinary men asked to do extraordinary things. Private Leo Miller survived the battle. A promotion to corporal and a Purple Heart, his only tangible souvenirs. He would return home to Ohio, to a world of green grass and sunny afternoons. But the game of baseball would never be the same. He would watch his son play, and when the boy would wind up and throw a perfect strike, a part of Leo's mind would see not a catcher's mitt, but a dark slit in a coral rock face. He would feel the weight of the Mk2 in his hand and smell the cordite on the air. He was a living testament to the strange and terrible irony of his war, that the simple, joyful act of throwing a ball, a skill born of American innocence, had been forged into a brutally effective weapon, and that the men who laughed at the game were ultimately consumed by it.